Camping, for as long as we can remember, has always been the setting to a family trip. Away from all the distractions, technology and society. Leaving you all vulnerable in being yourselves. Replacing your surroundings of concrete and chaos, to being welcomed by nature and the purity within. But Mother Nature herself cannot control those who wander into her domain. Leaving everyone as fragile as the flame of the campfire. It's been 38 years this month, since 3 generations of the Johnson and Bentley families had gathered for a camping trip in Wells Gray Provincial Park. Leaving the country horrified to the events that took place. I would like to use this moment in having you understand, this is an extremely graphic and noxious experience. So please make yourself comfortable as we begin.
In 1982, my wife and I, our daughter and son-in-law, along with their 2 daughters, had planned a camping trip in Wells Gray Provincial Park. We were a really close family and loved the great outdoors. I remember how excited my grandchildren were. They were really excited to go fishing. I only wish I could have protected them. By the end of the trip, we were shot, kidnapped, raped, and set on fire. This is our story. It was a beautiful morning, one worth getting up early for. I remember my grandkids calling me first thing.
Make sure you bring the fishing gear, Grandpa.
My wife and I, and our daughter and her son-in-law, along with our 2 beautiful grandkids, had planned a camping trip in Wells Gray Provincial Park. We were to be there for 2 weeks. We had spent the week prior in having our camper van packed. This was going to be our longest camping trip together. We had made our way east of central British Columbia, where we had met our daughter at our designated camping spot. We had picked a perfect location as we wanted something remote and secluded from everyone else. When we first got there, I had the grandkids occupied by having them gathering sticks for the fire. My son-in-law and I had begun to unpack our things as my wife and our daughter began setting up for lunch. About an hour went by and we all gathered next to Bear Creek and began having our lunch. Hot dogs and potato salad. It was so peaceful, and life for that moment couldn't have been any better. After lunch my grandkids were to ask,
"Can we go fishing now, Grandpa?"
And of course, how could I say no? I remember coming back to camp, and the kids were excited to show off the fish we caught. We were all so proud of them. The evening fell fast as the day was busy in getting everything settled while entertaining the kids. The sun started to go down as we all sat around the fire. I remember the kids were a little frightened, as would most, in being in the wilderness during the dark. My daughter had then crawled into the camper with the kids and laid there while they had fallen asleep. My daughter and her husband has their own tent set up, but the kids wanted to sleep in our camper. It must have been around 11 p.m. when we decided to pack it in. My wife and I headed into our camper as my daughter and our son-in-law headed for their tent. I remember laying there and hearing the frogs and occasional loon in the background. What we didn't know was during our trip out here, my granddaughter, Janet, who was 13, had attracted the interest of a man at a gas station a couple days prior. He was never seen, but he watched from afar as he was sitting in his car. He then had stalked Janet for 48 hours, following them all the way into Wells Park. Come to think of it, I remember passing his vehicle about 2 kilometers from our camping ground. He was just parked on the side of the road. I had figured it's someone just double-checking their map or using the bathroom. While we were sleeping, this man by the name of Ennis had begun making his way towards us. We were all out cold as the day was long, and we were excited for tomorrow. Ennis had carefully tiptoed around and analyzing where everyone was located. He begun heading towards the tent where my daughter and her husband were sleeping. He had quietly lifted the zipper to the tent. He had pulled out his .22 caliber gun and had shot my daughter and her husband in the head, killing them both instantly. This had awakened everyone in our camper. I used to hunt a lot during my earlier years, and I had recognized a gun going off. I quickly jumped to the window of the camper as my wife begun placing blankets over the kids. I could see a man squatting down outside of my daughter's tent. He turned around and looked directly at our camper as he begun to make his way over. I was in shock of what I just saw. I even questioned if I was dreaming. It was then the door to the camper swung open. Ennis had made his way in. I quickly reached out and grabbing both his arms. I knew I had to protect the kids. Ennis, during the struggle, had fired off the gun. A round went into my shoulder as I then dropped to the floor. He then raised the .22 and shot me point blank in the head. It was at that moment I was no longer able to protect my girls. I lay there bleeding as I took my last breaths. My wife was in hysterics as she just witnessed me being killed and assumed our daughter and son-in-law had also been killed. She stood up with her arms spread open and trying to protect our grandkids. There was nothing she could do. Not a prayer in the world was going to stop this man. He then has raised his .22 once again and shot and killed my wife, leaving just my grandkids to fend for themselves. He lifted the blankets to where Janet and Karen were hiding. They begun to scream as they saw my wife and I dead on the floor. Ennis had then stepped forward and began hitting both girls. Their screams turned into crying, which had made Ennis step down from the excessive violence. Little did any of us know. Ennis was only infatuated in Janet. Everyone was just in the way and must be killed. For nearly a week then after, Ennis had consistently raped and sexually assaulted Janet, all while her sister Karen was forced to watch. I couldn't tell you what they were thinking. They must have been so terrified. After Ennis was done with Janet, he had then took them both one at a time in the forest and shot and killed them. He then took all 6 of our bodies and piled them into a car, where he then set it on fire. It was a month later before anyone had found us. A mushroom picker had reported the findings to the burnt car. Little did he know, my family and I were inside. It was another 14 months before police and investigators were able to solve our tragic ending and find and arrest Ennis. At 62 years of age in 1984, Ennis had pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with no change of parole. Since then, Ennis had attempted for parole 3 different times, all in which were denied. It had been said if Ennis does receive parole that he would be placed in a halfway home. I share this from my grave. If Ennis is ever released, I will spend my eternal life finding and haunting him until he joins me, where I'll kill him myself.